Calder Finch set the divorce papers on his desk the way powerful men set down things they've decided are finished. Quietly, deliberately, without a second glance. He folded his hands and looked across at his wife of 9 years from behind a mahogany surface that had witnessed larger negotiations than this, and he said, in the measured, boardroom-level voice he reserved for decisions already made, "The settlement is fair, Marlo. More than fair. Sign it and we can both move on." He was already reaching for his phone before she reached for the pen. He never saw her hands pause above the signature line. He never saw her eyes move, not to the settlement figure, but past it, to the line at the bottom, where her name was meant to go. He never saw her almost smile. Subscribe to Crimson Secrets right now, and drop your city in the comments below. Because what happened next in that office is the kind of thing people spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. The morning Calder decided to end his marriage, he'd woken up feeling something he hadn't felt in at least 3 years. Certainty. Not the professional certainty he wore like a second skin, the kind that made junior analysts nervous and institutional investors comfortable, but something more personal. The certainty of a man who has been carrying a quiet guilt about what he wants and has finally decided to stop carrying it. He was 44 years old. He'd built Finch Capital from a 2-person operation out of a borrowed office in Lincoln Park into a real estate and infrastructure investment firm, managing close to $8 billion in assets across 7 states. He'd been on the cover of 2 business magazines. He owned a house in Winnetka he rarely slept in, and a condo in the West Loop he slept in more often than he admitted to anyone. Avery Locke had been his head of business development for 3 years. She was 36, brilliant, and in her presence Calder felt like the best version of the story. He'd been telling himself about his own life. He told himself that was about her professional instincts. He was experienced enough to know he was lying. So when he came downstairs that Tuesday and found Marlo in the kitchen, standing at the window with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking out at the yard in that quiet, self-contained way she had, the stillness he'd once found grounding, and had come, over time, to find unremarkable, he said only, "I need you at the office at 10, have Daniel drive you," and he left. She stood for a moment, looking at the space where he'd been. Then she set down her coffee, went upstairs, and called Harris Kwan. The law offices of Kwan Aldridge occupied the 31st floor of a building 2 blocks from Finch Capital's headquarters. Harris had been Marlowe's personal attorney for 11 years. He was 63, had argued before the 7th Circuit, and was the kind of man who ordered the same breakfast every morning, not from lack of imagination, but because he'd already solved that problem and preferred to spend his energy elsewhere. When Marlo arrived, he was standing. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He held out a chair and said, "Ready?" "Yes," she said. She sat, folded her hands, and said, "He's going to offer a settlement. Whatever the number is, I don't want it." Harris looked at her steadily. "Marlo, I know what you're going to say. I'm going to say you are walking away from a marital estate our team has valued at somewhere between $300 and $400 million, and that a family court judge in Cook County would very likely." Harris, she said his name the way she said things she meant completely. Quiet, firm, finished. "I never want his money. I want to walk out of that room today with nothing connecting my name to his. No settlement, no claim, no thread." She paused. "He needs to believe he won." Harris studied her face. After a long moment, he picked up his pen. "Then let's make sure he believes exactly that," he said. The conference room on the 39th floor of the Finch Capital building had been designed for exactly this theater of financial power. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. A table that seated 18. The kind of room built to make the person across from you feel the weight of what they were giving up. Calder had chosen it deliberately. He was already seated when Marlo arrived, his own attorneys flanking him, and Avery Locke standing near the east window in a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. There was no professional reason for his head of business development to attend a private divorce proceeding. Calder had brought her anyway, and he'd told himself it was because she'd helped him think through the asset structure, which was technically true, and almost entirely beside the point. Marlo came in with Harris at her side, and a younger woman named Imara, who carried a leather portfolio and said nothing, and whose title, had anyone thought to inquire, was Senior Associate at Drexel Family Office. No one inquired. Calder looked at Marlo when she entered and felt something he hadn't expected, a flicker of something he couldn't immediately name. She was wearing a dark blue dress he'd never seen before. Simple, nothing excessive. Her hair was pulled back. She looked like herself. That was the thing that unsettled him. Not composed in the way of someone bracing for confrontation, not grief-stricken, not steeled. Just entirely, completely herself. He covered the flicker immediately. He was very good at that. "Marlo," he said, the negotiation voice, the already decided voice, "thank you for coming." She looked at him across the length of the table. "Of course," she said. She sat down. She did not look at Avery, not once during the entire meeting. Not once, and somehow that was more devastating than any confrontation could have been, because it communicated without a syllable that Avery Locke was not significant enough to acknowledge. Avery's jaw tightened slightly. Calder didn't notice. His lead attorney, a man named Morton, who billed at $1,200 an hour and had the demeanor of someone who'd seen too much to be surprised, slid a document portfolio across the table. "The terms of the proposed settlement are outlined in Section 2. Mr. Finch has been very generous." "No, thank you," Marlo said. The room went quiet. Morton blinked. "I'm sorry?" "We decline the settlement offer," Harris said, placing his own portfolio on the table and opening it with the unhurried precision of a man who was genuinely enjoying himself. "My client requires no financial compensation from Mr. Finch, no property, no liquid assets, no structured payments of any kind." He paused. "She simply wants the divorce finalized, clean, mutual, today if possible." Calder stared at her. "Marlo, that's..." He stopped. "The Winnetka property alone is worth..." "I know what it's worth," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were still. "I don't want it." Something shifted in the room, not dramatically. The way a room shifts when a sound you've been hearing so long you forgot about it suddenly stops. Morton looked at his second chair. The second chair studied her notes. Avery, still at the window, kept her expression carefully, deliberately neutral. Calder looked at his wife and felt, for the first time, in longer than he could locate, something approaching confusion. Because in 9 years of marriage, Marlo had never surprised him. She'd been steady, warm, reliably present. He'd valued that once, and later, come to think of it as simple. And now she was sitting across from him, declining hundreds of thousands of dollars without blinking, and he did not know what to do with that. He did what powerful men do when they don't know what to do. He pressed forward. "If that's what you want," he said, and heard the stiffness in his own voice and didn't like it. "Fine, let's proceed." He signed his name. She picked up the pen. And she did not sign Marlo Finch. She did not sign Marlo Shaw. She signed Marlo Drexel. The pen made a clean, quiet scratch across the paper. She capped it. She placed it on the table. And then she looked up at Calder, and in her eyes was something he had not seen there in a very long time. Not anger, not grief, not the searching, hoping expression she'd had in the early years, when she still believed he'd turn back toward her if she gave him enough room. It was clarity. Complete. Unafraid. Irrevocable. For one suspended second, Calder Finch felt the floor tilt. "Drexel," Morton said. He was looking at the signature. His voice was carefully, professionally, empty, which in a lawyer of his experience was itself a form of alarm. "Marlo, Drexel." "That's correct," Harris said pleasantly. The room was very quiet. "What does that mean?" Calder said. Nobody answered right away. Amara closed her leather portfolio with a soft click, rose from her chair, and walked out of the conference room without a word. In the hallway, she took out her phone and made a call. The call lasted 38 seconds. Calder didn't know yet what it would cost him. He was still in the conference room, staring at his ex-wife's signature, turning the name Drexel over in his mind, looking for it somewhere in 9 years of memory. Trying to think back through dinners and arguments, and quiet weekend mornings, and industry galas, and the 10,000 small moments that make up a marriage, looking for some moment when she might have let something slip, some thread he'd left unpulled. He couldn't find one. Because Marlo Drexel, who had loved a young, hungry, terrified entrepreneur named Calder Finch in a small apartment more than a decade ago, had been very, very careful. You need to understand this part. You need to understand what Calder never did, which is what kind of woman had been sitting beside him for 9 years. The Drexel family was not the kind of name that appeared in Forbes or in the social columns of any magazine. They were not the kind of wealth that performed itself. They were the kind of money so old, so deliberately invisible, that the people who know about it speak of it the way people speak of geological formations, not as people, as conditions. Drexel Holdings controlled real estate, infrastructure, agricultural land, and private equity across 31 states and 4 countries. The family had begun building in the post-war boom of the late 1940s, when Marlowe's grandfather had made a series of land acquisitions in the Midwest that everyone around him thought were reckless and that turned out, over 6 decades, to be extraordinary. The current portfolio, by the estimate of the 3 people in the world with full visibility into it, was valued at somewhere north of $600 billion. Marlo was the only child of August Drexel, 71 years old, living on an estate in Virginia that appeared on no public record, who had agreed to his daughter's decision to live privately on exactly one condition, that she always had Harris Kwan's number saved in her phone. Marlo had met Calder when she was 29 and he was 31, and she had been living under the name Shaw, her mother's maiden name, and she had not told a single person who she was. Not because she was ashamed, not because she was hiding from anything, because she had spent her entire life watching people perform versions of themselves for the Drexel name, and she had wanted, just once, to be loved for what she actually was. She thought she'd found that with Calder. For 5 years, she thought she'd been right. The 6th year was when things began to change. She could trace it if she tried, and she had tried, in the small hours of too many nights, the first major acquisition. The first time a profile called him a visionary. The first gala where a woman looked at Marlo and then at Calder, with an expression that asked plainly, "Those two?" She watched him change the way you watch a season turn, slowly, and then all at once. The night she stopped making excuses was a Wednesday in October. They'd been invited to a dinner hosted by one of the city's largest institutional investors. Marlo had worn a dress she loved, deep green, simple, and her grandmother's diamond earrings. She'd come downstairs and Calder had looked at her for exactly 2 seconds and said, "Is that the plan?" Not cruelly, distractedly, the way you say something when your attention is already on the next thing. She'd gone back upstairs and changed. At the dinner, she stood near the back of the room with a glass of sparkling water she didn't touch, watching her husband work the crowd with Avery at his shoulder, and she noticed, really noticed, for the first time, that he moved differently when Avery was nearby, more energized, more present. He tilted his head when she spoke and gave her the full weight of his attention, the way he used to give Marlo, the full weight of his attention in that apartment in Lincoln Park a long time ago. She took a car home early. She sat in the kitchen with the lights off. And she called her father. "How are you, sweetheart?" August said. He always called her that. She told him the truth. She'd been keeping things from him for a while. Not to protect him, but because she was stubborn and private and did not want to be a woman who needed saving. But that night she was tired and she told him everything. When she was done, there was a long silence on the line. "You know you don't have to stay," he said quietly. "I know. I never needed you to prove anything." "I know that too." Another pause. "What do you need from me?" She looked out the kitchen window at the dark yard. The grass was still. The whole world was quiet in the particular way it gets at 2 in the morning when you are the only person awake in it and you are deciding something. 6 months, she finally said. I need 6 months. She spent those 6 months doing something Calder would not have recognized. She spent them carefully, methodically unwinding every invisible thread connecting her family's influence to his company's survival. Because there were threads. There had always been threads. The Drexel name, even unspoken, even unknown, carries a particular weight in the rooms where capital moves. Marlowe had used that weight exactly twice in 9 years. Once, in the very beginning, when Finch Capital was hemorrhaging its seed funding, and a single call from her father's office to a lender in New York had quietly, without explanation, changed the terms of a loan that saved the company. And once, 4 years later, when a larger competitor had attempted a predatory acquisition and found, mysteriously, that the institutional support they'd expected had simply evaporated. Calder had never known why that acquisition collapsed. He attributed it to his own strategic maneuvering. Marlowe had not corrected him. Now she spent 6 months making sure that when she stepped back completely. No lingering goodwill. No invisible cushion. Just Calder, alone in the market he believed he had navigated entirely by himself. She didn't do this from anger. That was the part that would be hardest for people to understand later. She wasn't angry. She was grieving. There is a difference, and it is an important one. Anger is hot and forward-moving. Grief is the weight of something that was real and is now over. Of choosing the version of yourself that tells the truth over the version that keeps pretending. She was grieving the man she'd met in Lincoln Park, because that man was gone. What was left was a polished, successful stranger wearing his face, and she could not stay married to a stranger simply because she remembered who he used to be. So when Calder set those papers on his desk that Tuesday morning, Marlo did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She did not list every late dinner she'd kept warm, every pitch deck she'd read at midnight, every terrifying early year she'd stood beside him through, believing in him, before anyone else had decided he was worth believing in. She picked up the pen. She signed her real name. She walked out of the building into the sharp October air and called her father. "It's done," she said. August Drexel, who had been sitting by his phone since 8 in the morning, with the patience who has spent decades understanding that the most important things always take longer than you want them to, said very quietly, "Good. Come home, Marlo. Let's get to work." Back in the conference room, Calder was still staring at the papers. His phone buzzed, then again. Then his investor line started ringing. He grabbed it and looked at the notifications flooding his screen. Messages from his CFO, from his head of investor relations, from his board chairman, from 2 of his largest capital partners. His primary credit facility had been placed under formal review. He looked at the signature, Marlo Drexel. He turned the name over in his mind, looking for where it fit inside the story he'd been telling himself for a decade. He couldn't find it, because the story he'd been telling himself wasn't the true one. It never had been. By noon, 2 institutional partners had requested emergency calls. By 2 o'clock, a financing line his company had relied on for 4 years was frozen pending review. By 4, Grayson Toll, 70 years old, chairman of Finch Capital's board since the Series B, called personally. "Calder," Grayson said, "I need you to explain something to me." "We're working through it," Calder said. "The credit review is procedural." "I'm not talking about the credit review." A pause. "I'm talking about why Drexel Holdings issued a quiet directive to their capital network this morning, flagging Finch Capital as a firm in a period of strategic transition." Calder's hand tightened on the phone. "What?" "You heard me. Drexel Holdings, Calder, one of the 3 largest private capital entities in the country." Another pause. "I need to ask you a direct question. Who is Marlo Shaw?" The question was so precisely, so surgically wrong that for a moment Calder couldn't speak. "Her name," he said carefully, "is Marlo Drexel." The silence on the other end of the line was the loudest thing he'd heard all day. "How long?" Grayson said slowly. "Have you been married to August Drexel's daughter?" 9 years. The sound that came through the phone was not quite a word. It was the sound a person makes when they are absorbing, something that doesn't fit inside any framework they've prepared for. And you didn't know, Grayson said, not a question. No, I didn't know. A long pause. Well, Grayson said finally, with the weight of every unsaid thing on both sides of that sentence. That explains the directive. He ended the call. Calder sat alone in his office, his hands flat on his desk, and looked out at the city he'd spent 15 years building a presence inside. He thought about a financing line that had mysteriously improved in its terms 9 years ago. He thought about a competitor who'd abandoned an acquisition attempt 4 years ago without ever giving a satisfying explanation. He thought about 9 years of things he'd attributed to his own strategy, his own judgment, his own relentless forward motion. He felt the ground shift beneath all of it. Avery resigned on a Friday afternoon. 3 weeks later, she'd been offered a senior position at another firm, one that had, not coincidentally, emerged from the same capital network, now cooling toward Finch Capital. She was professional. She was kind. Sitting across from her in his office, Calder realized he had confused intimacy with proximity. They had been close in the way that people become close when they are both extremely busy and mutually useful. He had mistaken that for something more significant than it was. After she left, he sat alone with that understanding for a long time. He thought about the green dress, about is that the plan, about the way her face had done nothing in response. No flinch, no flicker, and the way she'd gone upstairs and come back down in something else, and he hadn't thought about it again for 4 years. He thought about what kind of person absorbs that kind of carelessness, quietly, repeatedly, without complaint, and what it means that she finally stopped. He called Harris Kwan. Harris answered in 2 rings. Mr. Finch. I'd like to speak with Marlo. I'll pass that along, Harris said, with the gentle absolute finality of a door being closed by someone with excellent manners. She called back 4 hours later, unknown number. He answered before the second ring. Calder, she said. Her voice was the same. That was the first thing he noticed. Entirely the same. And something, in that sameness, the fact that she could go through everything that had happened and still sound exactly like herself, hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. Marlo. He'd prepared for this call. He had a structure, a sequence of things to say. He opened his mouth to begin. What came out instead was, I'm sorry. A short silence. Okay, she said quietly, not accepting it, not rejecting it, simply acknowledging that he had said it. I didn't know, he said, about your family, about who you. I know you didn't know, she said. That was the point. He stopped. Why didn't you tell me? He said. He heard how inadequate it was the moment it left his mouth. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was measured in the way things are measured, not because they're controlled, but because they've already been fully felt and fully processed, and what remains is simply the truth. Because I wanted to know if you would see me, she said, without any of it, just me, exactly as I am. A pause. And for a while you did, and then you stopped. And by the time you'd stopped seeing me, the reason had nothing to do with not knowing about my family. It had to do with who you had decided to become. He said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. I'm not calling to hurt you, she said. I know what the last few weeks have been. Then you know why I'm calling. Yes, she said, I do. The financing, the directive, the partners pulling back. My father made calls. He was protecting what was always the family's to protect. I didn't ask him to. I didn't stop him either. A pause. But Calder, that goodwill was never something you earned. It existed because of me, because of who I am, because certain people extended it for reasons you were never aware of. When I left, reality adjusted. That's not an attack. That's just the truth reasserting itself. He held the phone and felt those words settle into him with the full, quiet weight of something undeniably true. What do I do now? He finally asked, not with strategy in his voice, not with the management instinct that had governed him for 15 years, just the genuine, unguarded question of a man who has run out of frameworks. Build it yourself this time, she said, simply, not with any satisfaction in it, just clearly. The company is real. The technology is real. The relationships you've built directly, those are yours. Start from there. Stop relying on things you didn't earn. A pause. You were always capable enough without them. You just never had to find that out. He was quiet for a long time. That's the most generous thing anyone said to me in weeks, he finally said. I know, she said, that's why I'm saying it. The announcement came 8 weeks after the divorce, on a Wednesday morning, and it moved through the real estate and infrastructure world, the way things move, when people didn't know they'd been waiting for them. It wasn't a press release, it was a presentation. 40 minutes, live from a conference center in Washington, D.C., streamed to an online audience that exceeded 800,000 viewers by the time it ended. Marlo stood at the front of the room without a podium and without notes, in a dark gray blazer, hair down, and she looked like herself, the best version of herself. And this time that phrase meant something specific and true. She announced Drexel Ventures, a direct investment platform focused on infrastructure development, affordable housing, and supply chain modernization, operating under the Drexel family umbrella, but led entirely by her. The team she unveiled included 11 names from across the industry. People recruited quietly over the previous 18 months, several of whom had left prominent firms to join an organization they hadn't been allowed to name publicly until now. The platform was real, the capitalization was extraordinary, the vision was specific, and 20 years ahead of where the industry was currently looking. When a journalist asked how long she'd been working on it, Marlo looked at her for a moment, and something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but in the same family. Long enough to get it right, she said. Calder watched the live stream from his office with the door closed and his calls held. He watched all 40 minutes. When it was over, he sat with his hands on his desk and felt something it took him a while to identify, because it wasn't a feeling he was used to having about someone else's success. It was pride, not the kind that belongs to you, the kind that belongs entirely to someone else, and that you feel, anyway, in spite of everything, because you knew them before the world did. Because you were in the room in Lincoln Park when this was still just a quality she had. A way of thinking, a patience and a precision that he had mistaken, year by year, for quietness. He had confused her stillness for simplicity. He had confused her patience for absence. He had looked at her for 9 years and decided, somewhere around year 4, that he already understood everything she was. He had been so wrong it was hard to hold. The industry conference in Washington came 18 months after the divorce. His panel was Monday afternoon. Her keynote was Tuesday morning. He knew she'd be there. He'd considered not going. He went anyway, because avoidance belonged to the version of himself he was working very hard not to be anymore. He ran into her in the main hallway between sessions. She was walking with Philippa, her chief of staff, and she saw him from about 20 feet away and didn't alter her pace and didn't look away. She stopped when she reached him. Calder. Marlo. They looked at each other. 18 months of distance and reckoning and rebuilding. Everything compressed into 4 seconds between two people who had shared 9 years and a significant amount of loss. Your panel yesterday, she said, the thing you said about building for what you actually are versus what you've positioned yourself to be. You watched it? Yes, she said simply. Your keynote this morning, he said, the line about invisible labor, the people who hold things together quietly. Yes. They stood with that for a moment. The conference moved around them. I owe you an apology, he said, a real one. Not the one I gave you on the phone last year. That one was sincere, but it wasn't complete. I hadn't finished understanding what I was sorry for. She looked at him with the open, steady attention that had always been one of her qualities. The quality of someone who listens with their whole self, not just the parts that are waiting to respond. I failed to see you, he said, not your family, not what you were protecting or what you'd built, you. I looked at you every day and I saw someone I'd already categorized, and I stopped looking further than that. You deserved someone who actually tried to know you. She was very still. "I know you mean that," she said quietly. "I do." Something moved across her face. Not simple forgiveness, nothing that clean, but something human and complicated and real. "I'm not angry at you anymore," she said. "I want you to know that. What I believed we were going to be, what I thought I saw in you, in Lincoln Park, that I thought was going to stay." She paused. "But I've come to understand something. The man I fell in love with in that apartment is still in there. He's standing in front of me right now. He just got buried for a while under someone else's idea of who he was supposed to become." He didn't speak for a moment. He was holding what she'd just given him, which was more than he'd expected, and more than he deserved, and he knew both of those things simultaneously. "What does that mean for us?" he finally asked. Not with hope in his voice, with honesty, the genuine question of a man who has learned, slowly and at real cost, to ask clearly rather than assume. She considered it with the same honesty. "It means I don't carry any bitterness towards you," she said. "It means I'm glad you're doing the work. It means whatever comes next for both of us, I think you're going to be okay. And I genuinely mean that." A pause. "It doesn't mean I'm coming back. I want to be clear about that. What I've built is mine, entirely mine. And I'm not going to step back from it or minimize it for any reason." She gestured briefly between them. "This is something that happened, that changed both of us. That cannot be undone. And I wouldn't undo it even if I could." "You shouldn't," he said immediately. "You should never apologize for what you've built." "I know," she said, and the smallest, most genuine version of a smile crossed her face. "I just wanted to make sure you knew I know." He almost smiled back. It was the most familiar thing he'd seen in 18 months. Her chief of staff appeared at her elbow, quiet, professional. The lunch session. "I'll be right there." Marlo looked at Calder one last time. "Take care of yourself," she said. And she meant it with the specific gravity of a woman who spent 9 years doing exactly that for him, and is now, for the first time, able to say it as a wish rather than a responsibility. "You too," he said. He meant it the same way. She turned and walked toward the work that was waiting for her, toward the people who were building something with her she had constructed out of patience and precision, and the long, unwitnessed courage of a woman who always knew her own worth, and simply waited, with extraordinary steadiness, for the rest of the world to catch up. He watched her go. Not with longing, exactly, or not only with longing, with the particular, clarifying vision of someone who can now see what they could not see from 2 feet away. What they could not see from 2 feet away, arriving too late to change the outcome, is still clarity, still worth having, still in its own quiet way a form of grace. He put his phone in his pocket and walked back toward the conference hall. He had a company to build honestly this time, from the ground up, on nothing but what he actually was. And somewhere across that building, in a room full of people who had finally caught up to what she'd always known about herself, Marlo Drexel was already building something that would outlast every story anyone had ever tried to tell about her. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen. Marlo Drexel built an empire in the time it took the wrong person to open his eyes. And the truest thing about her is not the wealth, and not the platform, and not the extraordinary life she built in the margins of a marriage to someone who had forgotten how to look. The truest thing is this: she never needed his recognition to know what she was worth. She simply, finally, stopped offering her energy to someone who had decided she wasn't worth the effort of finding out.